How to Keep Cool with Jane Austen. In today's third episode of the Georgian Sisters Express journey through the world of Jane Austen, I'm asking myself the question, how to keep cool with Jane Austen? Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Georgian Sisters Express journey through the world of Jane Austen. As you may already know, or if you don't, I'm telling you now, my sister Lakshmi and I have recently embarked on this journey in our very own carriage, the Georgian Sisters Express coach, through the world of Jane Austen to discover all we can about her life, her stories, her world then, but also her world today. We're also working hard to prepare a very special online Jane Austen shop. There'll be more news about that in the next episode. But for today, while Lakshmi is still working hard on product development, I am taking you on a cooling episode. As a lot of you will know, some of you will be in the midst of it like myself, a great part of the world is currently going through almost extreme heat waves. Now, you might be one of the lucky ones living down under where it's pretty cool at the moment, but if you're in Europe or in the United States, good chances that you're also going to have a hard time sleeping at night and that it's really hot during the day. Funnily enough, when I was thinking about this episode and what I wanted to be talking about, I remembered that tomorrow morning early I've got a video call with someone who lives in Melbourne in Australia. And I just thought, let me check what the temperature is out there. And my goodness, it was about 11, 12 degrees Celsius, whereas over here, we're between the 30s and 40s. And that made me dream just the very thought that while I'd be talking to her live, she'd be feeling so much cooler than I am, helped me feel a bit cooler. And that gave me a great thought. I thought, why don't we simply cool down and chill with Jane Austen and the coolest scenes in her stories? And then the first thing that sprang to mind after that was that actually we should begin with the birth of Jane Austen herself. She was born on the 16th of December, 1775, in a particularly chilly winter when it was all frosty and full of snow. And so I took Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home book and looked for that particular scene. Be prepared for a first bit of cool Jane Austen air coming your way. 7 years after the move, by the middle of December 1775, Mrs. Austen was heavily pregnant with her 7th baby. She'd been carrying the child for a whole month longer than she'd expected. But at least this one seemed to be small. She found herself more nimble and active than last time. It was an unusually harsh winter in Hampshire. The naturalist Gilbert White, who lived in the nearby village of Selborne, reported that by 26 November it was a very dark season, dark within doors a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The weather was damp, with copious condensations on the walls, wainscot looking glasses, etc., of houses, in many places running in streams. As November turned into December, still the baby did not appear. By 13 December, White noticed that in ponds the ice bears boys slide, and he heard that the country people who are abroad in winter mornings long before sunrise talk of much hard frost. A great freeze was on its way. And that is how our lovely Jane Austen was born. And as I'm hearing the crickets chirping around me, I am turning to Jane Austen's stories now for some moments of sheer wintry chilliness in Sense and Sensibility. "That is true," cried Marianne in a cheerful voice, and walking to the window as she spoke to examine the day. I had not thought of that. This weather will keep many sportsmen in the country. It was a lucky recollection. All her good spirits were restored by it. It is charming weather for them indeed, she continued as she sat down to the breakfast table with a happy countenance. How much they must enjoy it, but, with a little return of anxiety, it cannot be expected to last long at this time of year, and after such a series of rain, we shall certainly have very little more of it. Frosts will soon set in, and in all probability with severity. In another day or two, perhaps. This extreme mildness can hardly last longer, nay, perhaps it may freeze tonight. And moving on to Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth Bennet has just reached the cottage of Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas, now Mrs. Collins, together with Charlotte's father and sister. And as they've just arrived, Mr. Collins shows them the gardens. Every view was pointed out with a minuteness which left beauty entirely behind. He could number the fields in every direction and could tell how many trees there were in the most distant clump. But of all the views which his garden, or which the county or the kingdom could boast, none were to be compared with the prospect of Rosings, afforded by an opening in the trees that bordered the park nearly opposite the front of his house. It was a handsome modern building, well situated, on rising ground. From his garden Mr. Collins would have led them round his 2 meadows, but the ladies, not having shoes to encounter the remains of a white frost, turned back, and while Sir William accompanied him, Charlotte took her sister and friend over the house, extremely well pleased, probably, to have the opportunity of showing it without her husband's help. And after the ladies' cold feet in Pride and Prejudice, we're moving on to this one scene in Mansfield Park where Fanny Price is feeling chills down her spine for several reasons. When suddenly the sound of a step in regular approach was heard. A heavy step, an unusual step in that part of the house. It was her uncle's. She knew it as well as his voice. She had trembled at it as often, and began to tremble again at the idea of his coming up to speak to her, whatever might be the subject. It was indeed Sir Thomas who opened the door and asked if she were there, and if he might come in. The terror of his former occasional visits to that room seemed all renewed, and she felt as if he were going to examine her again in French and English. She was all attention, however, in placing a chair for him and trying to appear honoured, and in her agitation had quite overlooked the deficiencies of her apartment, till he, stopping short as he entered, said, with much surprise, "Why have you no fire today?" There was snow on the ground, and she was sitting in a shawl. She hesitated. "I am not cold, sir. I never sit here long at this time of year." "But you have a fire in general." "No, sir." "How comes this about? It must be some mistake. I understood that you had the use of this room by way of making you perfectly comfortable. In your bedchamber I know you cannot have a fire. Here is some great misapprehension which must be rectified. It is highly unfit for you to sit, be it only half an hour a day, without a fire. You are not strong, you are chilly. Your aunt cannot be aware of this." In Northanger Abbey, there aren't really that many chilling moments when it comes to temperature. There are scary moments, at least in Catherine Morland's imagination. But when it comes to cold weather, there's that one moment when it's all a bit wet and muddy. But apart from that, the coolest scene that I have found temperature-wise is this one, in which Catherine Morland is touring the grounds at Northanger Abbey, together with the General and Eleanor. Having taken her into every division and led her under every wall till she was heartily weary of seeing and wondering, he suffered the girls at last to seize the advantage of an outer door, and then expressing his wish to examine the effect of some recent alterations about the tea-house, proposed it as no unpleasant extension of their walk, if Miss Morland were not tired. But where are you going, Eleanor? Why do you choose that cold, damp path to it? Miss Morland will get wet. Our best way is across the park." "This is so favourite a walk of mine," said Miss Tilney, "that I always think it the best and nearest way, but perhaps it may be damp." It was a narrow, winding path through a thick grove of old Scotch firs, and Catherine, struck by its gloomy aspect and eager to enter it, could not, even by the General's disapprobation, be kept from stepping forward. He perceived her inclination, and having again urged the plea of health in vain, was too polite to make further opposition. He excused himself, however, from attending them. On to Persuasion, in which Sir Walter talks about the dreadful effects of frost in Bath. The worst of Bath was the number of its plain women. He did not mean to say that there were no pretty women, but the number of the plain was out of all proportion. He had frequently observed as he walked that one handsome face would be followed by 30 or 35 frights, and once as he had stood in a shop in Bond Street, he had counted 87 women go by, one after another, without there being a tolerable face among them. It had been a frosty morning, to be sure, a sharp frost, which hardly one woman in 1,000 could stand the test of. But still, there certainly were a dreadful multitude of ugly women in Bath. And as for the men, they were infinitely worse. Such scarecrows as the streets were full of. And if the temperature hasn't dropped a bit yet in your case, I do hope it has, then I'm sure this scene, imagining it, picturing it, seeing yourself as part of it, is going to do the trick. Let me take you to the famous Christmas scene in Emma, where Emma is in the carriage with her brother-in-law John Knightley, who's having a proper rant. "A man," said he, "must have a very good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside and encounter such a day as this, for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. 'Tis the greatest absurdity. Actually snowing at this moment, the folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out, such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself, and keep all under shelter that he can. Here are we setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said and heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again tomorrow. Going in dismal weather, to return probably in worse. 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing but to convey 5 idle, shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home." And later that same evening, as the snow situation has been getting worse, Mr. John Knightley now came into the room from examining the weather, and opened on them all with the information of the ground being covered with snow, and of it still snowing fast, with a strong drifting wind, concluding with these words to Mr. Woodhouse: "This will prove a spirited beginning of your winter engagement, sir. Something new for your coachman and horses to be making their way through a storm of snow." Poor Mr. Woodhouse was silent from consternation, but everybody else had something to say. Everybody was either surprised or not surprised, and had some questions to ask, or some comfort to offer. Mrs. Weston and Emma tried earnestly to cheer him, and turn his attention from his son-in-law, who was pursuing his triumph rather unfeelingly. "I admired your resolution very much, sir," said he, "in venturing out in such weather, for of course you saw there would be snow very soon. Everybody must have seen the snow coming on. I admired your spirit, and I dare say we shall get home very well. Another hour or two's snow can hardly make the road impassable, and we are 2 carriages. If one is blown over in the bleak part of the common field, there will be the other at hand. I dare say we shall be all safe at Hartfield before midnight. Now I hope that these delightful Jane Austen scenes will have brought down the temperature a bit for you, and I wish you very cooling moments as long as the heat is on. And if where you are it's not quite so hot, I still hope you enjoyed these lovely scenes. Looking forward to meeting you again soon.
Get your free coach ticket now. Sign up below and hop on board the Georgian Sisters Express.